All right. Hey, folks. Today I want to do a almost reaction slash discussion of a talk between Geoffrey, Verity, Schofield and Steve Hall, which I saw a few days back and I made some notes on. The discussion was called Science-Based Lifters, Why Are They Hated? And the thumbnail had some fairly strong verbiage. It said small, weak, pathetic science-based lifters. Quite a strong use of words, which was surprising. I will talk a bit later in the video about the consequences of engaging in this type of verbiage and what it adds to the larger discussion, if anything. But first of all, I want to say the two people who were having the discussion, GVS, Geoffrey, he's my boy, great guy, can't fault him. Steve Hall, also decent dude. I actually have a long history with Steve. I met him. He was competing at a show where one of my clients was also competing in a different division. So we had a brief talk there, and him and I have talked in private about private things. He's definitely not somebody who I consider to be a bad player in the industry. So this talk, as is always the case with things that I say, is more to help you guys out. And it's more a dissection of the conversation rather than a look at the personalities or trying to pick apart rights or wrongs from either character in the discussion. So just bear that in mind and let's all proceed respectfully, which I think is a hallmark of one of the main points in this entire discussion, is to act in good faith. So the discussion started off with Steve presenting a definition of somebody who is science-based. And he went on to say it was someone who tracks their lifts, monitors progression, uses RAR every now and again, so basically doesn't always train to failure, but does sometimes, and considers their stimulus to fatigue ratio. Now, what I really liked about the discussion and the way it started off was that definition is quite broad. I thought, well, hold on a second. Sensible lifters were doing that. What do I say on this channel all the time? Progressive power measures in good standardized form for a good bodybuilding rep range. So people were already doing that a long time ago. So somebody who tracks their lift, that isn't the domain of a science-based lifter. Somebody who monitors progression. I was using paper logs long before there were mobile phones. And people have been tracking their progression for decades. So again, not necessarily something which is in the domain of a science-based lifter. Also, somebody who doesn't always train to failure. Now, we never called it RAR before, but yeah, sure. There were plenty of times where I would do sets across. In fact, that is the basis for my wizard routine. Quite a lot of those sets were just sets across. 5 by 5 is still an RAR approach because the first sets are not to failure. And also somebody who considers their stimulus to fatigue ratio. I mean, again, it's just good bodybuilding practice. So what I really enjoyed about that was, I don't think Steve intended to do this intentionally because, like I said, I think he's a good guy, but you sort of create a straw man where you define science-based lifters as people who are just doing sensible stuff. As a consequence, you basically also define anybody who's not doing that as somebody who's not science-based, but also must be stupid because that stuff is all just obvious. Do you see what I'm saying there? There's a consequence to that definition because by definition, anybody who's not doing such basic things must be a dumbass and not know what they're doing. But also we're defining them as not science-based. So what I enjoyed about this was immediately GVS shut that down. I really like that. So Geoffrey, well done for that. He said, actually, what you're doing is you're just describing a lifter. And I totally agree with that. That was something that all good lifters do. And I would argue, actually, over the course of the decades, there's been just as many non-science-based lifters who have fallen into that definition of people who are doing things wrong, people who don't track their lifts, who don't monitor progression, who do always train to failure or always hold reps back. So there are plenty of people on both sides who consider themselves science-based or not, who make those mistakes. So I didn't think it was a particularly good point, a particularly productive point for the discussion to start off with a straw man, essentially defining anyone who's doing these very sensible practices as science-based, because then has the consequence of saying who's not doing those basically good, sensible practices, which we all pretty much should agree on, is a dumbass and not science-based. You see what I mean? It sets up the science-based guy as being the guy who knows what he's doing, and anybody else not. And I think that is a common theme in what we see. And it's probably one of the annoyances of people who don't see themselves as science-based. They get lumped into this category of, if you're not science-based, well, you don't know what you're doing. But anyway, I'll go into that a little bit later on. So that was the first point. I thought that was a prickly point to start off on. So that was the first point that I wanted to make. I thought it was an interesting straw man, maybe an unintentional straw man, but it was a straw man nonetheless. Now, the second point, which I picked up on, was this differential between science-based versus evidence-based. I have to say, initially, I didn't really understand why we were starting to separate science-based versus evidence-based. Now, from what I know, for all practical intents and purposes, if people have a problem with the science, it is the educators who themselves say they are evidence-based. So I thought it was an interesting use of terminology, trying to set up a difference between people who are science-based versus people who are evidence-based. We always sort of create this new category of people who we call science-based, and then we can rally against them. Now, I understand why Steve did that, because he classes himself as evidence-based, as do I. But science-based is maybe a separate group, and we can rally against that. Now, what I want to do is maybe explore the definition of science-based, so we know what we're arguing against. Because, as I say, the original definition doesn't really hold water. That just describes something sensible. So what are we debating against here? And why have we invented this classification of guys who are known as science-based lifters? What is the difference between a science-based lifter versus an evidence-based lifter? So in my mind, people who have a problem with the science essentially do not differentiate between science-based versus evidence. I would like to put forward a definition for how to separate between science-based versus evidence-based lifters. Okay. I personally think you're science-based if you defend the studies vigorously, but you don't actually follow them yourself. That's my definition. That's what I want to put forward as a definition, because I consider that contradiction to be harmful. If you are actively supporting the studies in your science communication, but you don't actually do this when it comes to your own training because you don't believe in them. So you sat there and you vigorously defended 52 sets per week and the data which shows an infinite apparent relationship between hypertrophy and volume. But in reality, you don't do that, and you never have. Or you tried it and you didn't get any results. That means you're science-based. You're not based in reality. And if you really think about it, that is who mainstream bodybuilding is actually rallying against. It's those people who say ridiculous things online, like defend 52 sets, but they don't actually believe in it themselves. They don't do it. Because I know what the reaction, as soon as I start talking about how ridiculous 52 sets is, you get any number of reactions from the science apologists. The most common one is, well, that's not what the study says. But it is. The second one is, well, no one actually believes that. Like, well, why are we defending it then? The third one is, well, you only do it for specialization phases. How does that make it any better? How does it make it any better to do 52 sets per week for a specialization phase? How is that any better? It doesn't make it any more viable at all. So there's any number of excuses that people come up with to defend the study which has no bearing on reality whatsoever. For me, that is my definition of science-based, because it is actually harmful. You guys saw my example of the fellow who was doing the 35 sets of side delts per week and getting nothing. I did that video analogizing that to an imaginary statue. But that's the problem, isn't it? The problem is when the industry defends what are blatantly ridiculous statements, but don't actually practice that themselves and don't get any results from that, or the results are confounded by steroids, that's when it becomes harmful. And that, I think, is perhaps the definition of somebody who's science-based, because it's not matched with reality. So I would put that down as the more accurate definition of somebody who's science-based, as opposed to somebody who's evidence-based. And that is a surprisingly high number of people. I would say for a large part of it, that is a large part of what I see on the Reddit communities. Because the volume study was a fantastic example of this, right? In practice, people came down on that guy doing 35 sets of side delts per week and said, look, you're doing too much. Practically speaking, people warned him against that. But just 2 months earlier, people were vigorously defending the Pelham study. That is the definition of being science-based in my book. That's what I want to put forward to the community as the definition now of being science-based. You vigorously defend studies which make no sense in reality, and you have no real faith in them practically working. That's what I would say. Because again, the question is always, well, if you do believe in 52 sets, fucking do it then. But they don't. They don't. None of them do it, and none of them actually recommend that in their books. And that's also not a good thing. That's not to be used as a point to defend these people. They're saying, yeah, they do talk about the study, but practically they don't recommend it, so that's a good thing. Actually, no, I would say that's not a good thing. I would say that's actually more harmful, because you're still going to get people who are going to believe them, like the 35 sets of side delts guy with bone shoulders. So it is harmful. You can't use that as a point to defend these science-based communicators by saying they don't actually recommend that in their books or recommendations. Yeah, but they still defend the studies, and that will have an effect on people who listen to them, because it does. Where did that 35 set guy come from? He came from this science-based community saying more is better unequivocally, and people defending that study unequivocally, even though they would never defend it in practice. So this is the problem. And that really is where the hate from the mainstream bodybuilding community comes from. That is why the mainstream bodybuilding community does not look favorably upon these science-based guys, because what they say isn't matched in reality. Now, moving on to the next point. I think there is a larger problem where the science-based guys are labeling somebody as anti-science, because I think that is done in bad faith. It's done in bad faith, and there are numerous examples of these science-based educators doing things in bad faith and essentially attacking either the community or attacking prominent coaches who are very well respected, like Jordan Peters. Now, Jordan Peters, for the most, you can say what you like about his training philosophy. I've done a critique of it myself. But for the most part, the great thing about Jordan is he has been remarkably consistent in his message, but also in his results over the course of the last 10 to 15 years. When all the science guys have been doing various things, been changing their opinion on the flick of a dime, Jordan has been there consistently pushing everything I push: progressive poundages in good standardized form for a good bodybuilding rep ranges. His message has never changed, and it works. Jordan is not somebody to then disrespect, but that's the thing. Guys like that will get attacked. So it looks ridiculous when you have people who are new to the industry, who have accomplished exactly nothing practically, who then take on these large coaches. This is why science-based educators get a bad rap, because they're doing things in bad faith. There are numerous examples of these guys trying to make their mark on the community and acting in bad faith. Now, as a consequence, people are going to snap back. And for my money, 2024 was a particularly bad year for these science-based educators from that particular camp. And as a result, we're seeing a lot of public backlash against their message. And naturally, they're starting to get salty. It's been very clear for me to see. They started off trying to make a splash in the industry by being disrespectful and calling people out and saying traditional and attacking mainstream bodybuilding. And now they've seen the backlash because they keep changing their mind, keep getting things wrong. Now people are looking at them going, now you look ridiculous. And what we're seeing now is them turn salty. I'm seeing posts by Brad Schoenfeld, really salty posts about how people don't believe him and how they're stupid for not believing him. The arrogance is crazy. And I'm starting to see Dr. Pack in the comments on Instagram posts getting really salty. It's that level of childish arrogance. I'll give you an example. When I was a school teacher, right? And if I had to break up a fight between two boys, now typically the fight would have started because one of the boys would have said something about the other boy, right? For whatever reason. And then the other boy retaliated and said something back. And so the other boy escalated and shoved him. And then the first boy, instead of shoving him, punched it. And before you know it, there was a brawl and I was breaking it up. And when I took them into my office to say, hey guys, what happened? Well, he said this. The other guy would be like, well, he said this. So that is ridiculously what's going on here. You have these science-based communicators who came into the industry, and to get attention, they acted in bad faith by attacking mainstream bodybuilding and well-established coaches. And listen, I don't have a huge amount of a problem with that, as long as if you are giving it, you are also able to take it. Like, as long as you do it respectfully. But going into a new industry and purposely attacking mainstream bodybuilding and mainstream bodybuilding coaches, and then getting a bunch of things wrong and getting that whole Pikachu surprise face when the public just start laughing at you and ridiculing what you're saying and not believing in you. You can't then turn around and go, I guess people aren't science-based. Oh, dumbass. You created this situation. You came into this in bad faith. And now people don't like it because you know what? People don't like being called idiots. Surprise, surprise. You're apparently PhDs. How do you not see that? So with all that said, as always, I like to end with kind of a lesson for you guys, like the audience. What can we learn from this? What can we get out? Well, at the end of the day, I think you have to understand, and I'm sure a lot of you guys know this, a lot of this nonsense is done for entertainment's sake. Understand, a lot of this is likely done in bad faith because it is for entertainment. It's not for your education. Guys who are strongly defending the theory which has no reflection on practice, that is done in bad faith. We cannot possibly think it isn't. It's only ever done for the likes and the clicks and the views, because logically, none of those guys defending it actually promote it. But there's going to be somebody out there like our 35 sets of delts guy who's going to believe it, who's going to want the best of themselves and get themselves hurt and stagnated for months, potentially years. So it is done in bad faith. Don't look to those guys for your education. So if some science-based educator is presenting a great argument, trashing mainstream bodybuilding, defending some ridiculous study which nobody does, understand that's not for you. It's for that poor mug who buys a 20 grand imaginary statue. Don't be that guy. Right, guys, I hope that was a useful analysis of the situation. As I say, nothing personal against anybody in the video, but my loyalty is to you guys, my audience, and I'm trying to steer you away from what is an almost infinite amount of BS out there on this topic. Right, guys, I'll call it there. See you in the next one.